The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Adelaide Cottage, casting gentle shadows across the breakfast table where 10-year-old Prince George sat quietly eating his porridge. His parents, William and Catherine, exchanged meaningful glances over their teacups, both knowing that today would mark the beginning of a significant change in their eldest son's life. The weight of royal duty had always been a distant concept for George, something that existed in the background of his relatively normal childhood. But as 2026 approached, that distance was about to shrink considerably. Catherine reached across the table and gently touched George's hand. "Darling, your father and I need to talk with you about something important after breakfast." Her voice carried the warm tone she always used with her children, but George caught something different in it, a seriousness that made him look up from his bowl with curious blue eyes that mirrored his father's. William cleared his throat softly, remembering his own childhood conversations that had gradually introduced him to the realities of royal life. He had often wondered how his parents might have handled things differently, and now he was determined to approach this transition with the wisdom that came from his own experience. "It's nothing to worry about, son, but there are some changes coming that we want you to understand." George nodded solemnly, though his mind was already racing with possibilities. At school, his friends often asked him about being a prince, but he rarely felt different from them. He played football, struggled with mathematics, and complained about homework just like any other boy his age. The idea that his royal status might soon require more of him was both exciting and frightening. After breakfast, the family moved to William's private study, a room lined with books and family photographs that had become their sanctuary for important conversations. Charlotte and Louis were at their respective activities, giving the parents this precious time alone with their eldest. Catherine had spent sleepless nights preparing for this moment, knowing that their approach would shape how George viewed his future responsibilities. "George," William began, settling into his favorite armchair, while Catherine sat beside their son on the comfortable sofa. "You know that someday you'll be king. We talked about that before. But what we haven't discussed is that between now and then, there are steps we need to take to help prepare you for that role." The young prince's eyes widened slightly. He had always known about his future, but it had seemed so far away, like something that would happen when he was old like his great-grandmother had been. "Am I going to have to stop going to school with my friends?" he asked, his voice small with worry. Catherine quickly reassured him. "No, sweetheart. You'll continue at Lambrook, and your education will remain our top priority. But alongside your regular studies, we're going to begin introducing you to some of the work that comes with being a member of our family." William leaned forward, his expression gentle but serious. "The king, your grandfather, has been thinking about how the monarchy needs to evolve for the future. He believes that the earlier we begin preparing the next generation, the better equipped they'll be to serve the people when their time comes." George processed this information carefully. He had always admired his grandfather, King Charles, and felt proud during the few official events he had attended. The coronation had been particularly memorable, with all the pageantry and tradition that had surrounded the family. But the idea of taking on real responsibilities felt overwhelming. "What kind of work?" George asked, his natural curiosity overcoming his initial apprehension. Catherine smiled, recognizing her son's analytical mind at work. "Well, we thought we might start by having you join us for some of our engagements. Nothing too formal at first, but opportunities for you to see what we do and understand why it matters." William added, "Your mother and I have been discussing this with your grandfather and grandmother for months. We want to make sure that when you do step into a more public role, you feel confident and prepared, not thrown into the deep end." The room fell quiet as George considered their words. Outside, he could hear the distant sounds of the ground staff working in the gardens, a reminder of the many people whose lives were connected to the royal household. It was a weight that he was only beginning to understand. "Will I still be able to play football?" he asked suddenly, causing both parents to smile at his priorities. "Of course," Catherine laughed softly. "Your hobbies and interests are important to us. In fact, they'll probably become part of how you connect with people in your royal role." William nodded in agreement. Some of the most meaningful work I do involves sports and young people. Your love of football could open doors to helping other children who share that passion. This perspective seemed to brighten George's mood considerably. The idea that his personal interests could align with helping others was appealing to his naturally generous spirit. He had always been moved by the stories his parents told about the charities they supported and the people they met through their work. When would this start? George asked, his voice gaining confidence. Soon, William replied. We're planning to begin with some smaller engagements in the spring. Nothing too overwhelming, but enough for you to get a feel for what public service really means. Catherine could see the mixture of emotions playing across her son's face. George, I want you to know that this doesn't change how much we love you or how proud we are of the boy you are right now. This is simply the next step in helping you become the man you're meant to be. The young prince sat quietly for a moment, absorbing everything he had heard. He thought about his great-grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, and the stories he had been told about her dedication to duty. He remembered the sadness he had felt when she died, but also the pride in knowing that she had been his family. I want to do it right, he said finally, his voice steady despite his youth. I want to make you proud, and I want to help people like you do. William felt his chest tighten with emotion. At 10 years old, his son was already showing the kind of character that would serve him well as a future king. You already make us proud, George. Every single day, Catherine reached over and hugged her son, breathing in the familiar scent of his hair and marveling at how quickly he was growing up. We're going to take this one step at a time, together. You're not alone in this, and you never will be. As the conversation drew to a close, George felt a strange mixture of nervousness and excitement. The future that had once seemed impossibly distant was suddenly much closer, but with his parents' support, it felt less frightening and more like an adventure waiting to unfold. Can I think about it some more? He asked, showing the wisdom beyond his years that often surprised the adults around him. Of course, William said. Take all the time you need. We'll answer any questions you have, and we'll make sure you feel ready for each step. That evening, as George lay in bed looking up at the ceiling, he thought about the conversation with his parents. The weight of his future felt real for the first time, but it wasn't crushing. Instead, it felt like a challenge he could grow into, surrounded by people who loved him and believed in his potential. Outside his window, the lights of Windsor Castle glowed in the distance, a reminder of the long history he was part of and the legacy he would one day inherit. But tonight he was still just George, a 10-year-old boy who loved football, struggled with spelling, and was beginning to understand that sometimes growing up meant accepting responsibilities you never asked for but could learn to embrace. The next morning would bring new conversations, new preparations, and the beginning of a journey that would transform not just George's life, but the future of the monarchy itself. William and Catherine had planted the seeds of understanding, and now they would carefully nurture their growth, knowing that the little boy who had listened so attentively to their words would one day use that same attention to serve his people as their king. 3 weeks had passed since the conversation that changed everything for Prince George, and the reality of his expanding role was beginning to take shape. The royal household had been quietly buzzing with preparations, as William and Catherine worked closely with King Charles and Queen Camilla to design a careful introduction to public life that would honor tradition while protecting their son's childhood. George found himself in an unusual position at school, where his friends remained unaware of the significant changes being planned for his future. During break times, he still played football with the same enthusiasm, but there were moments when his mind wandered to the conversations happening at home about his upcoming responsibilities. His teacher, Mrs. Henderson, had noticed his occasional distraction, but attributed it to the natural growing pains of a bright child whose thoughts often seemed older than his years. The first concrete step came on a crisp February morning when Catherine entered George's room with a different energy than usual. She carried herself with the purposeful grace that George had learned to associate with important royal business, but Her smile remained warm and reassuring. "Today's a special day, my love," she said, sitting on the edge of his bed as he rubbed sleep from his eyes. "Your father and I are going to visit a children's hospital in London, and we thought you might like to come with us." George sat up immediately, fully awake now. This was what his parents had been preparing him for, his first real glimpse into their world of public service. "Will there be cameras?" he asked, his voice betraying a mixture of curiosity and nervousness. "A few," Catherine admitted honestly, "but they'll be respectful, and we'll make sure you're comfortable. The most important thing is the children we're going to meet. Some of them are very brave kids who are fighting serious illnesses, and I think you'll find them inspiring." As they drove through London later that morning, George pressed his face to the window, watching the familiar city streets pass by with new eyes. He had been to London countless times, but today felt different. Today, he wasn't just Prince George going somewhere with his parents. He was beginning to step into his role as a working member of the royal family. William, sitting beside him, seemed to sense his son's thoughts. "Are you nervous?" he asked gently. George considered the question carefully. "A little. What if I say something wrong?" "Then you'll learn from it, just like everyone does," William replied with a reassuring squeeze of his son's shoulder. "The most important thing is to be yourself and to listen. These children have incredible stories, and they'll teach you more than any textbook ever could." The Great Ormond Street Hospital came into view, its modern facade bustling with activity. George could see a small crowd gathered outside, and he realized with a start that they were there to see his family. The weight of public attention, something he had only experienced in small doses before, suddenly felt very real. Catherine noticed his intake of breath. "Remember, darling, these people are here because they care about the work being done at this hospital. They're not here to judge you. They're here to support something important." As their car pulled up to the entrance, George saw children pressed against windows in the upper floors of the hospital, their faces bright with excitement. Something about their enthusiasm cut through his nervousness, replacing it with a genuine desire to meet them and understand their experiences. The hospital's chief executive, Dr. Sarah Matthews, greeted them at the entrance with a warmth that immediately put George at ease. She had been briefed about the young prince's first official engagement and had worked closely with Catherine to ensure the visit would be meaningful rather than overwhelming. "Your Royal Highness," she said to George with a smile, "the children are so excited to meet you. We have some very special young people here who I think you'll find quite remarkable." Their first stop was the cardiac ward, where George met Emma, a 7-year-old girl who had been born with a complex heart condition. Despite her medical challenges, Emma's infectious laugh filled the room as she showed George her collection of stuffed animals, each one given to her by nurses or volunteers during her long stays at the hospital. "This one's my favorite," she said, holding up a well-loved teddy bear wearing a miniature football jersey. "I named him George after the prince." The coincidence brought a genuine smile to George's face, and he found himself sitting cross-legged on the floor beside Emma's bed, listening intently as she explained the names and stories of each stuffed animal. Catherine watched from across the room, her heart swelling with pride as she saw her son's natural empathy in action. "Do you like football too?" George asked Emma, remembering his father's advice about finding common ground. "I love it," Emma replied enthusiastically. "The nurses let me watch matches on the television here. I support Arsenal because they wear red, and red is my lucky color." George didn't mention that he preferred a different team. Instead, he found himself genuinely interested in hearing about Emma's favorite players and her dreams of attending a match once she was well enough. Their conversation flowed naturally, and George began to understand what his parents meant about the privilege of meeting extraordinary people through royal duties. Their visit continued through several wards, each stop revealing new stories of courage and resilience. George met Marcus, a 12-year-old boy undergoing treatment for leukemia, who had started a blog to help other young patients cope with their diagnoses. He spoke with Lily, a 9-year-old artist whose paintings decorated the walls of the children's recreation room, each one created during her long recovery from a spinal surgery. What struck George most profoundly was not the sadness of their situations, but the remarkable strength and positivity these children displayed. They asked him about school, about his siblings, about his hobbies, treating him not as a prince, but as a new friend who happened to be visiting their temporary home. During lunch in the hospital's family room, George found himself in conversation with several parents whose lives had been turned upside down by their children's illnesses. Sarah Mitchell, whose 8-year-old son was recovering from a rare genetic disorder, spoke about the incredible support they had received from the hospital staff. "It's places like this that remind you of the best in humanity," she told George. "The doctors, nurses, volunteers, they don't just treat the medical condition. They care for the whole family." George listened carefully, beginning to understand how the royal family support for institutions like Great Ormond Street went beyond simply showing up for visits. Their patronage brought attention, funding, and recognition to the vital work being done behind these walls. Dr. Matthews took the opportunity to explain to George how the hospital operated, from the cutting-edge research being conducted in their laboratories to the family support services that helped parents navigate the emotional challenges of having a seriously ill child. She spoke passionately about the need for continued funding and public support, and George found himself genuinely interested in the practical aspects of running such an institution. Being a patron of charity isn't just about attending events, William explained to George as they toured the research facilities. It's about understanding the work they do so you can be an effective advocate for their cause. The afternoon flew by more quickly than George had expected. As their visit drew to a close, he found himself reluctant to leave. The children had made such an impression on him, and he wanted to continue learning about their experiences and challenges. Emma appeared at his side as he prepared to go, holding the teddy bear she had named after him. "Will you come back?" she asked with the directness that only children possess. "I'd like that very much," George replied honestly. "Maybe next time I can bring my football to show you some tricks." Her face lit up with delight, and George realized that this was what his parents had been trying to help him understand. This work wasn't about duty or obligation. It was about connection, about using whatever privileges and platforms you had to make a difference in other people's lives. As they drove home that evening, George was unusually quiet, processing everything he had experienced. The cameras that had worried him that morning had barely registered once he became absorbed in meeting the children and learning about the hospital's work. "How do you feel?" Catherine asked gently. George considered his response carefully. "Grateful," he said finally, "and like I want to do more." William and Catherine exchanged a meaningful look over their son's head. This was exactly the response they had hoped for. Not overwhelming ambition or pressure to perform, but a genuine desire to use his position to help others. "There will be plenty of opportunities for more," William assured him. "But today was perfect. You were natural, caring, and genuinely interested in the people you met. That's exactly what this work is about." That night, as George prepared for bed, he thought about Emma and Marcus and Lily and all the other children he had met. Their bravery in facing challenges he could barely imagine had left a lasting impression on him. He understood now why his parents spoke so passionately about their charitable work and why they had wanted him to experience it firsthand. The transition from childhood to royal responsibility no longer felt like something being imposed upon him. Instead, it was beginning to feel like an opportunity to be part of something meaningful, something that could make a real difference in the world. And with his parents' guidance and the support of his family, George felt ready to take the next steps on this important journey. The spring of 2026 brought a gentle acceleration to Prince George's introduction to royal life, carefully orchestrated by William and Catherine to balance his growing responsibilities with the normal rhythms of childhood. The success of his hospital visit had given everyone confidence that he was ready for more substantial engagement, but his parents remained vigilant about protecting his emotional well-being during this crucial transition. George's second official engagement took him to a completely different environment, a youth football academy in South London that had been supported by the Prince's Trust for over a decade. As their car wound through the urban streets, George observed the stark contrast between this neighborhood and the comfortable suburbs where he spent most of his time. The rows of council flats and busy high streets told a story of resilience and community that he was only beginning to understand. "Today will be different from the hospital," William explained as they approached the academy. "These young people aren't facing medical challenges, but many of them have had to overcome difficulties that would surprise you. Football has become their pathway to better opportunities." The Riverside Football Academy occupied a collection of converted warehouses beside the Thames, their brick facades brightened by colorful murals painted by local artists. As George stepped out of the car, he was immediately struck by the energy of the place. The sound of footballs being kicked, coaches shouting encouragement, and young voices celebrating small victories and learning from defeats. Marcus Thompson, the Academy's director, had dedicated his life to using sport as a vehicle for social change. A former professional player himself, he understood both the transformative power of football and the harsh realities facing many inner-city youth. He had worked closely with Williams' team to ensure George's visit would be educational rather than merely ceremonial. "Your Royal Highness." Marcus greeted George with a firm handshake and genuine warmth. "Welcome to our little corner of paradise. Are you ready to see what real football looks like?" George's eyes lit up at the challenge in Marcus's voice. He had been playing football since he could walk, but he sensed that what he was about to experience would be different from the genteel matches at his private school. Their tour began in the main training hall, where a 15-year-old from across South London were participating in an intensive coaching session. The diversity of the group was immediately apparent. Young people from Caribbean, African, Eastern European, and British backgrounds working together with a shared passion that transcended their different origins. "This is Jamal." Marcus introduced George to a lanky teenager with lightning-fast footwork. "He's been with us for 3 years, and last month he was offered a place in Chelsea's youth development program." Jamal's shy smile transformed his entire face as he shook George's hand. "Pleasure to meet you, Your Highness." Marcus always says football opens doors, but you have to be willing to walk through them. The wisdom in those words struck George immediately. Here was someone barely 5 years older than himself who had already learned profound lessons about opportunity and responsibility. As they watched Jamal demonstrate his skills, George found himself genuinely impressed by the technical ability and mental focus required to excel at this level. "Would you like to join in?" Marcus asked George, producing a football from seemingly nowhere. Without hesitation, George kicked off his formal shoes and joined the group on the artificial turf. The initial awkwardness he had expected never materialized. These young people were more interested in his football ability than his royal status, and George found himself relaxing into the familiar rhythm of the game he loved. "Not bad, Your Highness," called out Amara, a 16-year-old girl whose powerful shots had already caught George's attention. "But can you handle a real challenge?" What followed was the most competitive and joyful hour George had experienced in months. The academy players tested his skills without mercy, but also supported him when he struggled with techniques that were new to him. Their natural coaching ability impressed him almost as much as their football talent. During a water break, George found himself in conversation with Destiny, a 14-year-old whose story epitomized the academy's mission. Raised by her grandmother after her parents struggled with addiction, she had discovered football as an outlet for the anger and frustration that had once gotten her into trouble at school. "Football saved my life," she told George with a matter-of-fact honesty that seemed characteristic of all the young people he was meeting. Not just the game itself, but the discipline, the teamwork, the goals it gave me to work toward. George was learning that behind each player's skill lay a personal story of overcoming obstacles that would challenge adults, let alone teenagers. Their resilience humbled him and made him think differently about his own challenges and privileges. The Academy's academic program proved equally impressive. In converted classrooms upstairs, George observed young people who had struggled in traditional schools, thriving in an environment that connected their learning to their passion for sport. Mathematics lessons incorporated statistics from professional football. English classes analyzed sports journalism and autobiography, and science explored the physics of ball movement and human performance. Education and sport can't be separated, explained Mrs. Rodriguez, the head teacher who had left a prestigious private school to work at the academy. These young people are incredibly intelligent, but they need to see how their learning connects to their dreams. George spent time in a business studies class where 17-year-olds were developing proposals for community sports programs they hoped to implement in their neighborhoods. The sophistication of their thinking and their genuine commitment to giving back to their communities impressed both him and the adults accompanying him. "I want to start a program for younger kids like I was," explained Tyler, whose proposal focused on using football to support children struggling with literacy. "Sport helped me find confidence, and now I want to pass that on." The lunch break provided an opportunity for more relaxed conversation, as George joined the young people in their canteen for a meal of fish and chips that tasted better than anything served in royal dining rooms. The conversation flowed naturally from football to school to family to dreams for the future, and George found himself sharing more about his own experiences than he had expected to. "It must be weird, knowing your whole future is already planned out," observed Kamal, a thoughtful 15-year-old who hoped to combine a football career with studying engineering. George had never thought of his situation in quite those terms, but Kamal's observation resonated with him. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but meeting people like you makes me think about how I can use that future to help create opportunities for others." The afternoon's activities included a mock trial where Academy members argued cases related to sports ethics and fair play. George was assigned to a team defending a hypothetical player accused of diving to win a penalty, and he found himself working harder than he ever had in his expensive private school's debate club. "Good arguments," Amara told him afterward. "But you need to think more about what it's like when winning might be the difference between your family eating or going hungry. Changes your perspective on cheating, doesn't it?" Her comment stayed with George throughout the rest of the visit. He was beginning to understand that moral choices became more complex when viewed through the lens of real hardship, and that his privileged position brought with it a responsibility to understand those complexities. The highlight of the day came when George was invited to present certificates to Academy graduates who had secured places in professional club development programs, university scholarships, or apprenticeships with major corporations. Standing before 30 young people who had transformed their lives through dedication and hard work, George felt the weight of his own opportunities more acutely than ever before. "These young people represent everything that's best about this country," he said, speaking without notes for the first time in a formal setting. "Their determination, their talent, their commitment to helping others, they're an inspiration to all of us." The spontaneous applause that followed felt different from the polite recognition he was accustomed to receiving. This was genuine appreciation for words that came from his heart rather than from a prepared script. As their visit concluded, Marcus pulled George aside for a private conversation. "You've got something special, Your Highness," he said. "These young people don't give their respect easily, but you earned it today by treating them as equals and learning from them." George felt a flush of pride at Marcus's words, but more importantly, he felt a growing understanding of what effective royal engagement could accomplish. His presence had brought additional media attention to the Academy's work, but more than that, his genuine interest in the young people's stories had validated their experiences and aspirations. The drive home provided time for reflection and discussion with his parents about everything he had observed and learned. George found himself asking questions about education policy, social inequality, and the role of sport in addressing societal challenges, topics that had never occurred to him before this day. "You're starting to think like a future king," William observed with obvious pride. "Not about the ceremony or the protocol, but about the real issues affecting your future subjects." Catherine added, What impressed me most was how naturally you connected with everyone you met. That's not something that can be taught. It's a gift that you can develop and use to make a real difference. That evening, George video called his grandfather, King Charles, to share highlights from his day. The king listened intently as George described the young people he had met and the programs he had observed, asking thoughtful questions that demonstrated his own deep understanding of the social issues involved. The monarchy's future depends on our ability to understand and connect with all aspects of British society, King Charles told him. Days like today are invaluable preparation for the responsibilities you'll inherit. As George prepared for bed that night, his mind was full of faces and stories from the academy. Jamal's determination, Destiny's transformation, Tyler's vision for helping others. Each encounter had added a new dimension to his understanding of what it meant to serve as a member of the royal family. He was beginning to see that his future role wasn't just about representing tradition and continuity, but about using his platform to highlight the extraordinary potential that existed throughout the kingdom. The young people at the academy had taught him that opportunity combined with hard work could overcome almost any obstacle, and that success carried with it an obligation to lift others up as well. For the first time, George felt genuinely excited about the responsibilities that lay ahead of him, not because of the status they would bring, but because of the opportunities they would provide to support and celebrate people like those he had met today. By late spring 2026, Prince George had settled into a rhythm that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. His carefully planned introduction to royal duties had evolved from tentative first steps into confident strides toward his future role. The transformation hadn't gone unnoticed by those closest to him, nor by the British public, who had watched with growing affection as their future king began to find his voice. The most significant test of George's development came with an invitation that initially filled both him and his parents with apprehension. The Commonwealth Youth Forum had requested that George participate in their annual conference, not as a silent observer, but as an active participant in discussions about the future of the organization he would one day lead. It's a big step, William admitted during one of their family planning sessions. You'd be speaking to young people from across the Commonwealth, sharing your thoughts about issues that matter to your generation. George, now more confident after his previous engagements, felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. What if I don't know enough about the Commonwealth? What if the other young people think I'm just there because of who I am? Catherine smiled at her son's concern, recognizing the thoughtful consideration he was giving to his role. That's exactly why you're ready for this, George. You're asking the right questions, and you're thinking about earning respect rather than expecting it. The weeks leading up to the forum became an intensive but fascinating education for George. He met with Commonwealth scholars at Cambridge University, learning about the organization's history, its current challenges, and the diverse cultures and economies of its 54 member nations. Each briefing opened his eyes to the complexity and potential of the association he would inherit leadership of. Dr. Priya Sharma, a political scientist who specialized in Commonwealth affairs, became an invaluable mentor during this period. Her patient explanations helped George understand not just the facts about member nations, but the emotional and historical connections that bound such diverse countries together. The Commonwealth isn't just about shared history, she explained during one of their sessions. It's about shared values and a commitment to supporting each other's development. The young people you'll meet at the forum represent the future of this partnership. George found himself particularly drawn to learning about youth-led initiatives across the Commonwealth. From environmental conservation projects in the Caribbean to technology innovation hubs in Africa, young people were addressing global challenges with creativity and determination that reminded him of the academy players he had met in London. The forum itself took place at a modern conference center in Birmingham, deliberately chosen to showcase a diverse British city that embodied the multicultural reality of modern Commonwealth membership. As George arrived on the first morning, he could feel the energy of 300 young people from across the globe, all gathered to discuss their vision for the future. Unlike his previous engagements, This event positioned George as a participant rather than a visiting dignitary. He was assigned to a working group focused on youth entrepreneurship, where his royal status was acknowledged but not central to the discussions. For the first time, George experienced what it meant to be valued for his ideas rather than his title. His group included Fatima from Nigeria, who had developed a mobile app connecting rural farmers with urban markets, James from New Zealand, whose social enterprise provided employment for young people with disabilities, and Prisha from India, who had created an innovative water purification system for remote communities. The thing about being young is that we see solutions where adults see problems, Fatima explained during their first group session. We don't know what's supposed to be impossible, so we try things that others wouldn't attempt. George found himself inspired by their entrepreneurial energy and practical approach to global challenges. When the conversation turned to the role of traditional institutions in supporting youth innovation, he surprised himself by speaking up confidently. I think institutions like the Commonwealth have to prove their relevance to each new generation, he said, drawing from his recent education and his own evolving understanding of royal responsibility. We can't just assume that because something worked for our parents, it will automatically work for us. His contribution sparked an animated discussion about modernizing international organizations while preserving their valuable aspects. George discovered that his unique position gave him insights that complemented rather than overshadowed his peers' perspectives. The highlight of the forum came when each working group presented their recommendations to a plenary session attended by Commonwealth ministers and officials. George found himself elected by his group to deliver part of their presentation, a responsibility that both honored and challenged him. Standing before an audience that included seasoned diplomats and young activists, George felt the weight of representation in a way he never had before. He wasn't just speaking as Prince George. He was speaking for his generation's vision of the Commonwealth's future. Our generation has grown up global, he began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. We've been connected to each other through technology since childhood, and we see challenges like climate change and inequality as shared problems requiring shared solutions. The Commonwealth has the potential to be the perfect platform for this kind of collaboration, but only if it evolves to match our expectations and energy. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Young people throughout the audience nodded in recognition, while the older attendees appeared genuinely engaged with the fresh perspective George and his peers were offering. For the first time, George felt he was truly contributing something valuable to an important conversation. During the lunch break, he was approached by Amara from Ghana, a climate activist whose passion and eloquence had impressed him during the morning sessions. "That was brilliant," she told him. "You weren't speaking like a prince, trying to sound relevant. You were speaking like one of us who happens to be a prince." Her comment captured perfectly what George was learning about effective royal engagement. His value lay not in trying to pretend he was the same as everyone else, but in bringing his unique perspective while remaining genuinely connected to shared concerns and aspirations. The afternoon sessions included a conversation with Commonwealth ministers about youth priorities for the organization's future. George found himself sitting at a table with government representatives from across the globe, discussing policy initiatives with a confidence that surprised even him. When the Pakistani minister asked about engaging traditional monarchies in youth development programs, George drew from his recent experiences to offer concrete suggestions. "Young people respect authenticity above everything else," he said. "If royal families and traditional leaders want to remain relevant, they need to demonstrate genuine commitment to the issues young people care about, not just ceremonial support." His response earned appreciative nods from both the ministers and his fellow young participants. George was beginning to understand that his future role would require him to bridge different worlds, translating between generations and institutions while remaining true to his own values and insights. The forum's final day included a cultural celebration that showcased the diversity of the Commonwealth through music, dance, and food from dozens of nations. George found himself learning traditional dances from the Caribbean, trying spicy dishes from South Asia, and discussing art with young creators from across Africa. This is what the Commonwealth should feel like, he told Catherine during their evening phone call. Not formal meetings and speeches, but real connections between people who share common hopes for the future. His enthusiasm was evident to everyone around him, and Catherine felt a deep pride in how naturally George was growing into his role. He wasn't mimicking his parents or following a script. He was developing his own authentic approach to royal engagement. The forum concluded with participants signing a declaration outlining their vision for a commonwealth that prioritized youth leadership, environmental sustainability, and economic innovation. George signed alongside his new friends and colleagues, feeling for the first time that he was genuinely part of something important rather than simply observing it. The journey home provided time for reflection on everything he had learned and experienced. The young people he had met had challenged his assumptions, inspired his thinking, and welcomed him as an equal contributor to important discussions about the future. "I think I understand now what you meant about service," he told William as they drove through the familiar countryside toward home. "It's not about being above people or different from them. It's about using whatever advantages you have to help achieve things that matter to everyone." William felt his chest tighten with emotion at his son's words. At just 10 years old, George was articulating a philosophy of leadership that had taken William decades to develop. The careful introduction to royal duties was clearly succeeding beyond their highest expectations. That evening, the family gathered for dinner with Charlotte and Louis, who had missed George during his time at the Forum and were eager to hear about his experiences. As George described the young entrepreneurs he had met and the ideas they had shared, his siblings listened with rapt attention, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated their own growing awareness of the family's unique role. "Will I get to do things like that too?" Charlotte asked with evident enthusiasm. "When you're ready," Catherine assured her. "But for now, George is showing us all how to grow into these responsibilities with grace and wisdom." Later that night, George called his grandfather to share highlights from the forum. King Charles listened with obvious pride as George described his conversations with young people from across the Commonwealth and his growing understanding of the organization's potential. "You're learning something that took me many years to understand," the king told him. "The monarchy's strength lies not in its traditions alone, but in its ability to adapt those traditions to serve each new generation's needs and aspirations." As George prepared for bed, he thought about Fatima's app helping farmers, James's work with disabled youth, and Prish's water purification system. Their innovations were making real differences in people's lives, and George felt inspired to think about how his own future platform could support similar efforts. The boy who had nervously asked about continuing to play football just months earlier was now envisioning ways to use his royal role to amplify the voices and work of young changemakers across the Commonwealth. The transformation had been gradual, but profound, guided by loving parents who understood that preparation for kingship meant developing both character and competence. Looking toward the future, George felt not the weight of obligation, but the excitement of opportunity. He was beginning to see that being a future king didn't mean following a predetermined path, but rather using his unique position to help build the kind of world he wanted to inherit and pass on to future generations. The young prince had found his voice, and it was authentically his own.